Hi, this is Paul. Sometimes my thoughts come from my reading of this little old listserv called CRC Voices that I've mentioned on the channel plenty of times. It's sort of slowed down. But one of the issues that they've been kicking around quite a bit has been the Christian Reformed Church's relationship with Christian education. Now, Gray and Jordan and Annie Crawford have done a fair amount of talking about Christian education. Homeschooling has developed in the last few decades, which has become an attractive choice for a lot of Christians. But the Christian Reformed Church has been doing Christian education for a very long time. And one of the things that Christian Reformed churches tended to do fairly early on when they would begin rooted in a community, and a lot of this started with the dynamics of immigrant society. They didn't want the government or the broader society educating their children. So Christian Reformed churches, as communities, started Christian schools. Now, their Christian schools weren't owned and run by the church, and in that way they're different from the parochial schools that the Roman Catholic Church would tend to run, or even a lot of Lutheran churches would tend to run parochial schools. Schools in the Christian Reformed Church were, again, this goes back to Abram Kuyper, were owned and operated by parent associations who would found the school, govern the school. The churches were deeply associated with the Christian Reformed Church, and church and school would often sort of work hand in hand. It was also the practice traditionally in the Christian Reformed Church that if you are a member of the Christian Reformed Church, the Christian Reformed Church itself would work very hard to have, at least when I was growing up, what was called a booster club. And what that would mean would be that the church itself would help pay the Christian education for your child going to school if you didn't have enough money to pay the tuition for the Christian education. And for that reason, a lot of children, let's say my age and younger, and it still is the case in some places, a lot of children of the Christian Reformed Church went to the Christian school owned and operated by parent associations from the Christian Reformed Church. This was a very big deal. And, you know, it's funny, one of the videos that I wanted to do was more on Jordan Hall's conversation with Ross Bird, because Jordan Hall can be fairly bombastic about education and government education. And if you're allowing the government to educate your child, you're basically turning your child over to the government. Now, again, many people today have turned towards homeschooling, but homeschooling, not everybody's cut out to be a homeschooler. And so to have community-owned and operated schools like the Christian Reformed Church has done for a very long time is an interesting thing. Now, one of the other current obsessions on CRC Voices now is sort of tracking decline numbers and looking at doing a deep dive into numeric decline in the Christian Reformed Church, especially with respect to the current split that's underway in the Christian Reformed Church, with probably about 10% of the churches leaving. But again, this is an unusual split because it's not technically a split, because again, conservatives tend to calve off and progressives tend to sort of leak away. So conservatives split and the right splits and the left tends to leak. They've been doing some studies on the distribution of, this is a church in West Michigan, the age distribution of the church in 2005 compared to 2024. So in 2005, 12% of the congregation was 0 to 11. 25% was 12 to 18. 10% was 18 to 24. 11% was 24 to 34. 16% was 35 to 49. Maybe 11% was 50 to 64. And 11% was 65 and older in 2005. Looking at the same congregation in 2024, you have low single digits from basically 0 to 64, and 40% of the church is over age 65. Now that's enormously rapid aging for one church, and there's probably other complications. With any given church, there's going to be a whole bunch of local questions, but this has been going on throughout the Christian Reformed Church. The Christian Reformed Church, like many denominations like it, has been aging quickly. Numbers of children have been declining. Overall membership has declined. And of course, this is something that we've talked about quite a bit. But it's helpful to remember that with the Christian Reformed Church, there's two dominant institutions in the Christian Reformed Church. There's obviously the church, but there's obviously also this network of Christian schools around the United States and Canada. And what has happened with this demographic decline in Christian Reformed churches is that because the Christian schools are parent association run, these schools have to survive somehow with far fewer children. What's the easiest way to do that? Well, attract other children. And actually, if I was in Chicago for was that Midwestuary? Yeah, I was in Chicago for Midwestuary, talking to some parents in Christian education, talking about how Timothy Christian Schools is just sort of unrecognizable from what it was 20 or 30 years ago, but in a good way. Bigger buildings, better facilities, way more children. You can see that in Whitensville, Massachusetts. You can see that in many places in the Christian Reformed Church where, while churches are struggling, the Christian schools are booming. And then I was in Port St. Lucie, Florida, for that event in the Christian Reformed Church, looking at the Sunlight, where they, using the Florida voucher system, have sort of tinkered with the formula because they've kept the Christian schools as owned by the church. But what they've done is use that voucher system, and they would grow the schools first and then grow the church with the school. So that was sort of an opposite way from the way the Christian Reformed Church had been operating. And part of what's happened in the watersheds of synods 2022 to 2025 in the Christian Reformed Church is obviously a lot of the groups that were far more open to same-sex marriage, tended to be more progressive politically, tended to be more hostile to Donald Trump. A lot of those people have been lamenting that, well, the Christian Reformed Church has sort of forsaken its educational roots. The Christian Reformed Church has always prided itself on educating well its youth, catechizing them well, growing them up well, and for many, sort of, let's say, on the more progressive end of the Christian Reformed Church, which is the side of the church that's sort of being exiled right now, they find the Christian schools have sort of been their ally because the Christian schools were sort of the feeder systems to kind of the crown in the Christian Reformed jewel, which was Calvin University. Now, obviously, Calvin University is going through some pretty dramatic changes. The sociologist Christian Smith just caused a lot of waves by writing this piece for First Things that says, "Why I'm Done with Notre Dame." It's quite a read, and I've got a lot of thoughts about this article, some of them with respect to Calvin University and what's happened in the Christian Reformed Church, because the dynamics are different. And I'm going to get into some of those. I'm not going to get into this article necessarily directly in this, but I am going to get into some other issues that are related to looking at the interesting relationship in the Christian Reformed Church between what's been happening with the churches, they're struggling in many cases, and the schools flourishing, and how that sort of maps onto bigger changes happening in the American religious sphere right now. This, to me, was prompted by an article that I read this morning entitled "The Surprising Revival, Gen Z Men and Highly Educated Lead Return to Religion." And I know that this current revival is sort of a debated thing, but follow the argument that I'm going to make. Now, I made a copy of this Voices post because not everybody's Voices is behind. It's not a paywall, but you have to subscribe. You have to sign up to read. There's no money in it. There's no money to do it, but not everybody's going to go through that steps of joining CRC Voices to participate in this conversation. So I decided just to post it on my sort of, how am I using leadingchurch.com now? I don't know. I threw it up on leadingchurch.com, not my Substack. I would probably want to rework this if I were going to do a Substack article out of it. But I wrote this out, so let's get into it. The Christian education thread is fascinating. This is the one in CRC Voices. And I think has everything to do with the transformations in the CRC through Synods 2022 to 2025. And I think in the relationship in the United States between Christian religious groups and the nation in general. Now, the Christian Reformed Church is about 75% American, 25% Canadian. And so for Canadians, your mileage may vary, and I'm not in any way familiar with the Canadian scene, so Canadians, feel free to leave a comment and let us know what you think. The CRC has followed the broader trend. See Ryan Burge on Catholic clergy who would and wouldn't officiate at a same-sex marriage, of youth within the church going traditionalists on certain key markers. Boundary markers are always indicators, but often selective and yet important. So Ryan Burge has had these series where he talked about this high percentage of Roman Catholic clergy that said they would officiate at a same-sex marriage if permitted. And then they tested that with respect to age of the priest, age of the Catholic clergy. And what they discovered is that young Catholics are much more traditional and conservative with respect to human sexuality than older Catholics. Now, this is where you begin to see sort of the differentiation in how churches are working in terms of the general population. This was something that I wrote for something else. The sexual revolution has passed through Western Protestant denominations like a sigh. A sigh that cuts, not a, well, that too, some of that. The Protestant mainline, which stood in as an invisible state church for Protestant North America, is in the process of being absorbed into the matrix of institutions that have arisen to manage the delegated needs of the broader community. The community of churches uneasily labeled as evangelical, more culturally ambitious than the cave bunker fundamentalists, less culturally flexible than the mainline, have come late to harvest gathering. Synods 2022 to 2025 represents the reaping of the CRC&A. When those who had been in the process of involuntary exile looked for someone to blame, they struck a decidedly xenophobic posture. It was the Neo-Puritans that fooled her. A fork in the emergent church movement, often labeled the Young Restless and Reforms, caught the imagination of Generation X, and new lights beyond the Christian Reformed Church shaped conservative Reformed thinking in the West. Keller, Piper, and Sproul replaced Berkhoff, Hoekema, and Eppinga. As the goal of non-Dutch diversity was reached, young people came in reading Puritan divines, listening to podcasts of celebrity pastors without Dutch last names. The wooden shoes were finally fully consumed, but not in the way the World War II generation expected. So part of what happens is that, I should read the part that I was actually thinking about. Let's see. So I had Ryan Burge's clergy numbers here. Back in the early days of studying church growth, Lyle Shaler noted that countercultural churches in America grow faster and remain more vital than culturally aligned institutions. While there are always innumerable points of contact where religious groups and individuals align or resist the culture war flashpoints, get all the attention. Churches continue as havens of shelter and resistance to broader cultural forces, and the CRC decided to continue that tradition. The broader de-churching of North America that has afflicted the CRC has left it, along with many other churches, to be smaller, more committed, more conservative body. In the summer of 2022, many saw the CRC's sharp turn to the right to be an anomaly when it was in fact the rule. So this is happening all over. If you look at the, if Catholic Church permitted, would Catholic priests perform a same-sex wedding? Among those born before 1950, 61 lean towards yes. Among those born in 1970 or later, 19% lead towards yes. That's an enormous swing. So what happens is that the young people of the Christian Reformed Church that no longer go to church basically continue to be formed by, you can call it the urban monoculture. You can talk it about, say, majority, blue state culture. They continue to be formed by the prevailing culture at large, by Netflix, by Hollywood, by the American educational system. And of course, part of what 100 years ago, when Christian Reformed churches decided to found Christian schools and they just kept doing it, suddenly these schools are, in many cases, increasingly countercultural compared to free public education available in the United States. And it's been interesting that, well, I'll get to this in some of the later points. There is no question that the conservative turn of the CRC saved it from the sort of numerical institutional collapse the Reformed Church in America is suffering from. This seems beyond argument. So where the Christian Reformed Church is experiencing they basically caused an involuntary exile of perhaps 10% of its churches and people. And of that 10%, a lot white and aging because, again, of the demographic split. The RCA has experienced a loss of 60%, 70% of their churches in membership. It's almost sort of the flip of what, say, you saw at Synod in terms of votes. The Reformed Church of America has just been completely devastated. The Alliance of Reformed Churches was begun because churches could leave the Reformed Church in America if they left to another denomination. The Christian Reformed Church, because our polity is different, because we have our roots in secessionists in the Netherlands, local churches own their buildings. The classis doesn't own it. The denomination doesn't own it. So if a church decides to leave the Christian Reformed Church, there are some rules in the church order which they may or may not abide by. Almost everyone has abided by them because they're very good rules, because what they avoid are lawsuits. So what tends to happen then is Christian Reformed churches just leave. And a whole bunch of the churches that have left the Christian Reformed Church, a lot of them from Classis Grand Rapids East, while their clergy sort of hopped to the RCA because of decisions made in the 20-teens, there was sort of a clergy sharing agreement. So a lot of clergy could just sort of hop to the RCA without any difficulty. But their churches haven't joined the Reformed Church in America. Most of those churches are just sort of independent right now until the church sort of figures out what it's going to do. Are they going to form a new denomination? Are they going to join the Reformed Church in America? The Reformed Church in America, there's some advantages to joining it, but I played a video with Dan Meter in it where basically they were saying, yeah, we're not just going to let any Christian Reformed church in because they're Christian Reformed. And it's like, you guys could probably use a lot of these Christian Reformed churches, but if you don't want him, we'll see what these churches do. This gets into the question of what are denominations for in the age of the internet and social media. And the recent Ready to Harvest video was interesting. I was thinking about that, but I'm not going to treat that here because I want to focus on this thing that I wrote. The marked difference between the thriving of CRC Christian day schools compared to the relative and opposite performance of CRC churches should be a focus of analysis for us. While the CRC never gained critical mass in Sacramento to begin a Christian school movement, looking around in other places, as noted in the Christian school thread, it seems safe to say, after anecdotal conversations in Chicagoland and Whitensville, Massachusetts, a large and a small CRC colony cluster. Chicagoland is a major CRC colony cluster, or at least was, and Whitensville just had two little Dutch Frisian churches. And when my cousins were my age, and most of my cousins in Whitensville are older than I am, they went to Christian school, but the Christian school was sort of K through 6, an unimpressive building. Today, the Christian school is unrecognizable. It's large, it's flourishing, there's all kinds of program, it's got a beautiful facility. It's really a remarkable thing. the school I grew up going to, Eastern Christian in the New Jersey area, again, another major CRC cluster, major CRC colony area, which church-wise has just been in free fall. Eastern Christian now has a Wikipedia page, and there are, like, the Jonas Brothers went to my high school, which that is a completely crazy thing to imagine if you knew what the high school was like when I went there, which was 95% of kids from the Christian Reformed Church, and no one else would go there. It was just the Dutch thing for the most part. And this has completely changed. So if the Christian Reformed Church, scale-wise, had done what the Christian schools have done, the Christian Reformed Church would, I don't know, be over 500,000 people and be significant players in many areas in the United States, even urban areas. But the Christian Reformed Church in world-class metropolitan areas is really dying. But some of those Christian schools are just flourishing. But that has caused a lot of discussion because the these Christian schools founded by the Christian Reformed Church are parent-led associations. Suddenly you have all sorts of questions about how do you maintain the committees that run these schools? And who do we let in the schools? In the past, they tended to be just children of the Christian Reformed Church, supported by the Christian Reformed churches themselves. Very quickly, they had to let in a lot of other kids. Even Calvin College is no longer majority Christian Reformed kids. So they had to, and Calvin University has a totally different trajectory in this. And, you know, I should really, well, if I bring in people who work for Calvin University, they have other obligations in terms of what they need to say. So who do you bring in? Do you let in only Christian families? If only Christian families, what background Christian families? Or do you see the Christian schools as sort of a missionary endeavor? Will you let in anybody and just say, hey, look, your child is going to get a Christian education here? Where do they look for teachers? So when I was in Florida, one of the things that the Christian Reformed Church down there is doing that is growing through founding parochial schools from Christian Reformed churches. Teacher training is their big thing because they've far outstripped the capacity of the Christian Reformed institutions like Calvin University or Dordt University to provide CRC Christian school teachers to teach in the school. The first degrees that Calvin College way back in the day when it was a prep school would grant were for people like my grandfather going into the seminary. The next program Calvin College added was Christian educators, and it's that dominant this was in the tradition of the Christian Reformed Church. So once you have to decide who can send their kids to the school, then you have to decide, how do you maintain the board? Must you be a member of the Christian Reformed Church to be on the school board? Or are you going to start allowing non-CRC members on the school board too? Because very quickly, a lot of the distinctives that these schools tried to maintain, or are they maintaining it? Because, and this is sort of where Calvin University is different, because Calvin University is owned by the Christian Reformed Church. And these are issues, legacy issues going all the way back to the founding of Calvin University. Professors at Calvin University have to sign an adjusted confessional statement. And this is something that's been a conversation for a very long time. And with the increasing confessional restrictions and observations that have been made by Synods 2022 to 2025, that has become an issue. And I should probably dig into the archives of the video from Synod 2025, because those were pretty. I went to Synod saying there are three issues I'm curious about: whether we're going to keep the temperature up on the confessional fever to keep working on the human sexuality stuff, whether trust will be regained, what will happen with the banner, because the banner was very much sort of a legacy institution. And then what's going to happen with Calvin, because Calvin and the Banner were sort of the crown jewels of the post-World War II revolution. Along the lines of another thread on CRC Voices, I pulled up this old piece by Robert Swearinga entitled "Burn the Wooden Shoes, Modernity and Division in the Christian Reformed Church in North America." And this is a really interesting piece. Another thing that came up on CRC Voices is that in the split, a much larger split in the Christian Reformed Church that happened in the 1990s, that launched the URC, the United Reformed Church, one of the big issues, a big question was, well, where does that split come from? And Mid-America Reformed Seminary, which is associated with that split pretty significantly, they've been doing a podcast, which sort of made me chuckle. And they've been doing a podcast on the seminary purge that happened in the Christian Reformed Church in 1952. But that seminary purge that happened in Calvin Seminary in 1952 happened because of the Second World War. The thesis of this paper is that the seeds of secession in the CRC&A, the secession of the 1990s, were planted at least 50 years ago. After the Second World War, this largely immigrant church experienced a generational change, both at the top and in the pulpits and the denominational schools, Calvin College and Theological Seminary, and at the bottom in the pews. The immediate cause was the return of military personnel. Thousands of second and third generation Hollanders served with the American military forces in the corners of the world, and more than 20 ministers in the Christian Reformed Church served as chaplains. The military experience changed many, and on their return, they called for the church to open up to the American scene and become more culturally diverse and contemporary. We ought to harbor a narrow isolationism as the very plague of death to our church, declared George Staub. Our people were afraid of America, afraid of the corrupting influences that might weaken our Reformed character and rob us of our heritage. Now, you see that in the motivation to start Christian schools and their own Christian institutions in America, because these Dutch immigrants were in some ways afraid of America. They were afraid of the contaminating force that America would give, and so they began their own Christian schools. It was time, added Harry Bohr, to leave our Dutchness behind and become truly an American church, burning the wooden shoes. By reaching out to all races and peoples, chaplains like Staub and Bohr, and indeed all the servicemen as well, were introduced to mainline American Christianity. Mainline, I wouldn't take that word too narrowly. And cultural diversity in the military chaplains, as were the new breed of campus pastors who the Christian Reformed Church Home Missions Board began placing on colleges and university campuses in 1941. Leonard Verdine at the University of Michigan was the first of these men. The war experience of some leaders thus dealt a blow to the church's ethnic and doctrinal isolation and weakened its homogeneity. In fact, in 1946, the number of Christian Reformed members transferring to other denominations increased by 40%. That's a big exodus. And continued to climb until 1951. Again, I would say that's a leak left, not a split right. There'd been a split right in the 20s, a small one relatively, but this is a leak left. People are transferring out of into probably mainline, likely PCUSA churches, Episcopalians, maybe some Methodists, probably churches like that. Their experience in the military sort of brought them in a place to be absorbed in the mainline boom that would happen throughout the Cold War. These losses were particularly heavy in Grand Rapids, Holland, and Chicago, most likely joined mainline churches or perhaps the RCA. Some veterans enrolled, courtesy of the GI Bill, in Calvin College and Seminary, the denominational school, and pushed their ideas that the Christian Reformed Church should move out of its status as a sheltered enclave and become more open to new ideas and attitudes. Chaplains who entered the parish ministry and took up teaching posts at Calvin College and seminary echoed the same themes. Many other vets, such as former chaplain Henry Ventil, arrived on campus with equally strong opposing convictions, believing that in the world's turmoil and upheaval, the Christian Reformed Church should hold fast to its principles and that any dilution of them would be perilous. So, in other words, some left this chaotic period of the war inspired to have the Christian Reformed Church join the main line, and others said, no, we've got to hold to our standards and continue to be even more scrupulous against corruption and stay separate. And that question would dominate the first period of after the Second World War. And the main line, those who wanted us to join the main line, would eventually win, except that the Christian Reformed Church wouldn't become mainline, because what was happening in the broader mainline churches was the rise of the evangelicals in post-war. And whereas the leadership cadre that is being exiled currently tended to align with the mainline, there are a lot of the rank and file much more associated with something much more like evangelicalism. And so that's really where the split in the 2020s has come through. This polarity in thinking caused some tensions on campus, so recalls Edward Harema, one of these students who stood firmly on the stand pat side. But the movers and shakers on the faculty and in the Plato Club of philosophers had the best minds, and they gained the upper hand. Now, this is the rise of the great philosophy department of Calvin College, the philosophy department that had Alvin Plantinga, Nick Waltersdorf, Richard Mao, and then the history department, George Marsden. And this was sort of the heyday of the boomer Calvin College crown jewel. A background factor in the generational shift was the sharply reduced influx of new immigrants since the 1890s and the strong forces of Americanization that were unleashed during the First World War and its aftermath in the Roaring '20s. So the war virtually stopped all immigration, and when it resumed afterwards, the new U.S. immigration laws of 1921 and 1924 sharply curtailed it. The Netherlands quota was set to, in 1924, to only 1,648 per year. So in other words, no more Dutch immigration for the CRC. So, and plus, of course, Dutch neutrality was observed in the First World War, and the Second World War, clearly it wasn't. So it's so interesting how immigration issues, relevance realization. You know, I've read this article a few times, and never before did I just say, oh, yeah, the effect of immigration, which, of course, the current president put in the news in 2014. Wow. The Netherlands quota was set. Oh, okay. These developments cut off the strong immigration stream that had given birth to and sustained the Christian Reformed Church. This was a key factor in the turbulent transition from Dutch to English language worship services in most Christian Reformed churches in the 1920s. The massive post-World War II immigration of Orthodox Calvinists to North America added a cultural dimension to these intergenerational tensions. The newcomers primarily settled in Canada because of the U.S. quota restrictions, but ministers called field agents, my grandfather was one of them, effectively marshaled them into the fold. Between 1950 and 1960, the Canadian membership of the Christian Reformed Church grew by nearly 50,000. The immigrants renewed a flagging ethno-religious identity among the second and third generations of U.S. Reformed Dutch, although it was remarkably short-lived. In contrast to the slow assimilation of 19th century immigrants, the post-World War II immigrants moved into the mainstream in one generation. These post-war Netherlanders had been changed by the war experience even more than the Americans. In church assemblies, the Canadians in the last 15 years had moved into the driver's seat in both conservative and progressive camps of the CRCNA. And this is part of what's been interesting about the current split in the Christian Reformed Church is it came at the same time where in Synod 22, where I was a delegate, The hot issue was, of course, the human sexuality report. If that issue had not been on the Senate docket, the hot issue would have been binationality because of a bunch of tensions between the American side and the Canadian side feeling like second-class citizens, they've not been well treated, these kinds of things. And so actually what I worked on in Senate 2022 was that issue. I was just a floor delegate for the human sexuality issue. The growth of Christian Reformed Church Christian schools is complex, but on the whole, as one of the voicers pointed out, part of the larger conservative revitalization and reaction to what has been happening in public education in America, and probably Canada too. Because what's interesting about the Canadian portion of the Christian Reformed Church is that you'll often find some of the most progressive and some very conservative, especially in the split in the 1990s over women in church office. A lot of the conservative Canadian pastors really led the exodus there. So it's very interesting how the U.S.-Canada relationship sort of plays with these issues. And now there's a significant number of more progressive CRCs in Canada that really feel very out of step, whether they've left officially or not. And there's also sort of a separate movement in Canada about just leaving a church that has its base south of the border. As Nate, also on CRC Voices, not our Nate Van Dennen, who you've known from the channel, as Nate pointed out, our schools aren't filling up with people aligned with CRC confessional particulars, but rather many who have been more easily associated with movement conservatism and anxiety over social changes culturally. One interesting note on the Christian school thread is Dawn's promotion of it, giving her outspoken criticism of the conservative pull within the CRC. The CRC Christian schools is a direct result of people fleeing the re-education of American and Canadian, don't know, Canadians can weigh in, children along the lines of new sexual orthodoxies, practices, and policies. If there is an area of public life where the promotion of new thinking regarding human sexual diversity has flourished, it is in public education. And this has motivated a lot of wall building and spending with respect to enclosures of preservation, especially in education of younger children. One of the big drivers of parents taking their kids out of public education is concerned over what kind of sexual education they are going to get in their public school. That's a big issue, and that's been a big issue for a while in the United States. And some will go to homeschooling, but others will look for an alternative. And Christian Reformed day schools are really attractive. Now, I'll talk about some of the what's gone on in the Catholic schools, but Christian Reformed day schools for Protestants and even people who don't go to church. Well, the Christian Reformed Church tends to be upper middle class, or solidly successful working class in many areas, so the schools are nice. We've had a high emphasis of education on our teachers. Our teachers tend to be sort of middle-brow evangelicals. And so people who skew conservative tend to like the Christian Reformed Church day schools. Richard, who was quite active in the corner for a while, eventually went to Biola. Richard grew up in Lyndon, Washington. His parents weren't Christian, but his father was a conservative, and so his father sent their son to Christian school, to the Lyndon, Washington. Again, another deep Christian Reformed colony. And what that meant was Richard became a Christian, and he became a conservative Christian, and eventually went to Biola, didn't go to Calvin. Probably would have been probably was more tempted by Dort, but of course Biola was in California, et cetera, et cetera. So what's happening is that the culture war in the United States is feeding Christian Reformed day schools in a way that it's not feeding Christian Reformed churches. The big winner of the culture war tends to be the non-denominationals. Burge had a great chart on the rise of non-denominationals in the last 15 years. It's been absolutely dramatic. And so I think the culture war is feeding non-denominational churches, but the culture war is feeding Christian Reformed day schools and not Christian Reformed churches. There's no question the movement around Trump is more conservative on sexual issues than Trump himself. Trump is usually tagged as a homophobe, but Trump has never really been a culture warrior on issues of sexual purity or traditionalism. He even removed the anti-abortion plank from the Republican platform in 2024. In this way, Trump derangement system of the left has obscured a more nuanced and accurate reading of how Trump himself is being used by people often more conservative than he is, and this is true in the Christian Reformed Church and beyond. It's really interesting as Trump obviously is getting older. The longer he gets into a second term, the lame duck energy will increase. How more and more I'm hearing people from the left say the problem really isn't just Donald Trump, it's the Republicans. So you just watch that balance shift because people are already starting to say posture themselves for the war that will be the 2028 presidential campaign. And so you'll hear people being less touchy about Donald Trump and more critical of the Republicans. Now, how the Republicans will fare post-Trump, I think, is a really open question, because I think Trump's been remarkably successful in putting together, especially in 2024, in putting together a coalition. And
if you don't keep moderates and the general public on your side. Now, that may sound like an obvious conservatives on the internet secret. I want to tell you a secret, one that most conservatives on the internet don't want you to know. A year into his second presidency, Donald Trump has lost the country.
The majority of voters believe the country's worse off today than it was a year ago.
Approval rating at 37%, the lowest of his second term.
A failure. Fail.
And the grand coalition that he united to defeat Kamala Harris has evaporated. And all of this was predictable. From the first days of Doge through the debacle in Minneapolis, the Trump administration has consistently governed as if swing voters aren't part of its coalition. And now, guess what? They're not.
Republicans faced a major loss over the weekend when Democrats were able to flip a reliably red state Senate seat.
That's an over 30-point shift to the left. If you ignore this, you're going to ice yourself out of a majority come the midterm.
But here's the thing. It isn't moderates and swing voters who lose out when the Trump administration becomes unpopular. It's people on the right, people like me, and certainly people further to my right, who support many of the things the Trump administration has tried to do, from securing the border to pressuring American institutions to become more ideologically diverse, to resetting and rolling back DEI. All of that agenda will just disappear if the Republican Party can't win elections. And it will disappear especially rapidly because it's an agenda that has been pushed primarily through executive power without congressional buy-in and support. In the long run,
Okay, so Doug Wilson said, well, we'll see about the midterms. And Wilson has a point. With the speed of our news cycles, the midterms are a ways away and a lot can happen, but it's interesting how things are both faster and slower, where, these campaigns run forever and things can change on a dime. Now, it's my experience that, let's say the Christian Reformed Church, 70%, this is before 2020, 70% of the Christian Reformed Church voted Republican and 30% voted Democratic. I think that's a pretty good thing. It's probably swung now because of the departure of the exiles. But most CRC people who voted for Donald Trump he wasn't their preferred candidate. they would have looked at Marco Rubio, or they would have looked at Ted Cruz. They would have looked at a more traditional, social, conservative, establishment Republican, but they weren't going to vote for Hillary Clinton or Kamala Harris or Joe Biden. That's the way they are. So that tends to be the kinds of people that have been often attracted to the Christian Reformed Church Christian schools, which are, again, run by the parents. Now, remember, in a church like the Christian Reformed Church, it tends to be the case that the clergy are a little bit more progressive than the rank and file. That's certainly been true of the mainline. It tends to be true of the evangelicals, and it tends to be true of the Christian Reformed Church, too. And remember, the Christian schools are run by the parents, not by the clergy. If we had a Christian school association in Sacramento planted by the Christian Reformed Church, would not be run by me. And often there's a degree of antagonism between Christian ministers in the Christian Reformed Church and the Christian school, because they often look at the Christian school as just sopping up all of the resources of the community, because schools are big, expensive buildings and institutions to run compared to the churches. So a lot of Christian Reformed Church money goes into those Christian schools, and once you've put a lot of your money into it, you're committed to it. The more you pay, the more it's worth. So back to Trump. In my most recent conversation with the identical twin separated by Trump, I got the answer I expected from the conservative brother, who would have liked to have voted for Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio than Trump. J.D. Vance is another great example. Many of these guys, in terms of human sexuality, are far more like religious conservatives than Trump, and have used Trump as the tip of the spear to pursue other issues Trump himself might not have been passionate about. Trump is a venal guy. I know, there's a lot of trouble. People will give me crap about me saying this, but it's like, come on. Let's just tell the truth. I grew up in the New York metropolitan area. Donald Trump was a known quantity. It has always been this way with Donald Trump, all right? You might love him, but it's just the truth about the guy. Donald Trump is a venal guy, and he's never really been a traditionalist on human sexuality beyond being traditionally promiscuous. This frustrates Trump's political rivals because he's been used by conservatives to pull together a coalition that has effectively blunted the progressive post-war consensus like nothing else we've seen before. And that's why you will hear Donald Trump's name come up in CRC fights, because somehow what happened in Synod 2022, when Trump wasn't even in office, was Trump was to blame for that. Oh, sorry, Trump was in office. I should get my 2020, 2016, 2020 was Biden, 2024. Okay, yes, he wasn't in office. At the same time, most public education is controlled at different levels than the federal government, which has been a policy of Trump's destruction of the Department of Education, putting public education much more on the state and local level politically. The CRC diaspora maps differently from the U.S. right and left mapping. So we'll see CRC red pockets and deep blue areas like Chicago and Massachusetts, and this too will fuel Christian Reformed day school growth. So if you've got a more conservative population of Christian Reformed people in a more politically progressive area, that will strengthen the Christian school, and that will attract more conservatives to it. And so you tend to get a virtue cycle if you're thinking mostly in terms of how much money can we attract and how many people can we attract to our Christian school enterprise. And again, similar thing has not happened with the churches. Nate's comments about, now you're only getting, this is like an epistle of Paul, you're only getting half the story here. If you want the whole story and you're interested in the Christian Reformed Church, you can go to Voices and read the postings. Nate's comments about Christian school growth and confessionalism are important. In many places, Reformed Roman Catholic schools have done well too. The movement conservative public can be pretty flexible on their confessional questions. They don't care about infant versus adult baptism. They don't care so much about the Trinity. They don't care about universal. They don't care about all these issues. They're looking for conservatism. And they're seeing religion as flagged conservative, which the press has been doing for quite a long time. And so they're like, I'm going to send my kid to a religious school. But what we've seen is that the dynamics of the Roman Catholic Church have been different. Remember again, the poll numbers. Let's see, where is it? Only 46 of Catholic clergy would say no to a same-sex wedding. Among those born before 1950, 61 leaned towards yes. Born 1970, 19% leaned towards no, which notes the worst-kept secret of all, if you're anywhere around parochial schools, that you think Roman Catholic institutions are necessarily conservative or are looking to invest in Roman Catholic confessionality. Cue Why I'm Done with Notre Dame by Christian Smith. Where are we? Nope. That's why I was put at the first tag. Fights over Roman Catholic schools have been way more fierce than over ours, partly because it's not uncommon to find Roman Catholic schools in places like the San Francisco Bay community that weren't teaching any Roman Catholic social doctrine. There was a young woman who came to my church, met another man at my church here. Actually, she came with him for a while. There were members here. She was raised conservative reformed. She was teaching in a Roman Catholic church, a Roman Catholic school in the Bay Area, and she could not believe how religiously and politically progressive everything about the school was. And it just kind of opened her eyes because she was expecting a Roman Catholic school. They'd be teaching Roman Catholic things. It's like, nope. Elements of the Roman Catholic experience in America became decidedly similar to Protestant mainline. She left, and they were members here for a while. Then they left to help with a church plant from a buddy of his from college, and now they're traditional Latin Catholic Mass Catholics. Attempts by some conservative clergy to rein this in have gotten a lot of press in the last few decades. How dare the priests say that X and Y about sexual minorities in their school? Or in Sacramento, there was a case where there was an OnlyFans mom who was using her OnlyFans money to send her children to the Catholic school. Word got out, and the Catholic school kicked out the kids. And she was upset, took her case to the local paper. How dare they kick out my kids because I'm raising the money for their tuition by selling racy pictures of me on the internet. There it is. Welcome to America. The Protestant Christian school area has long been evangelical, looser on confessional lines like infant baptism. There are other Christian schools in the area that are, and again, often they're sort of semi-parochial, sort of like what's happening with Sunlight in Florida, in that they're owned by an evangelical church or a Pentecostal church, and they just started a Christian school. But generally speaking, the quality of education, I might get in trouble here, but the quality of education in the Christian Reformed Church day schools has been higher and a bit more sensitive to, how shall I say this delicately? Sensitive to prevailing standards of education. It's expected that if you leave a Christian Reformed day school, they'd love it if you went to Calvin or Dort, but you should be able to get into Harvard or Yale. And in that way, some of the Christian Reformed Church's day schools have sort of been seen in sort of prep school energy. Like, they're getting a good enough education here at this Christian school, and it's traditional enough so that they're not having to monkey around with all kinds of things. Generally speaking, the student body at the Christian school is better behaved because the parents are coming from the kids are coming from intact Christian homes that tend to be solidly middle class, have family values. Again, this is what attracts movement conservatives. And a few of them might look at the Christian Reformed Church, but then they see things like, yeah, but then when then some of the confessional issues start to hold when they're looking at the church. But the school, usually far more flexible. Now, the dynamic being seen in Roman Catholic schools, I don't know what's going on in terms of the Orthodox and Christian education. You're still so small and so new here. And the fact that homeschooling is available now, and homeschooling wasn't thought of that much as sort of a thing 100 years ago. It was what was happening, but it wasn't sort of a movement. So the orthos haven't grown to this level yet, allowing them to ride the homeschool movement, which is a piece of this too. And this makes it a decidedly metagelical phenomenon. The Christian Smith Notre Dame First Thing piece is an interesting artifact in this whole question. Why won't Notre Dame be more confessionally Roman Catholic? As I noted before, AGE, what did I mean by AGE? Oh, age is an important aspect of this. I don't know if I wrote that before, I was just thinking about it. These dynamics with children are a lot different than they are with college students. Young men and women have a lot more say in what school they go to as college students than grade school or high school students. So the dynamics between the Christian day schools and the Christian colleges will be different. As I noted before, age is an important aspect of this, and the dynamics of the college and especially graduate levels will be very different from elementary and high school levels in terms of parental control and motivation. While the CRC churches are struggling, CRC schools were ideally located in many respects to ride this wave, and many of them have. Now enter this piece. The decline of religion remains a fundamental reality in most Western countries, particularly in Europe, where over 50% of those under age 40 do not identify with any faith. Even in more religious America, some estimate that as many as 100,000 churches will close in the near future. Meanwhile, the ranks of the nuns, those outside of religious communities, have grown so large that their numbers rival those of Catholics and evangelical Protestants. Yet, as we document in a new report for the Chapman Center for Demographics and Policy, there are signs that religion is enjoying more than a nascent revival. Data emerging from the 2020 suggests that we are witnessing a complex spiritual restructuring that intersects with economic mobility, demographic resilience, and a profound intellectual realignment. For the first time in decades, Pew Research notes, in the U.S. at least, Christianity has stopped its nosedive as more people begin to see efficacy and the rewards of religious faith and practice. This fragile development is especially noteworthy as it exposes growing divides and fault lines in American politics and culture. Drawing on a vast array of longitudinal studies, interviews, and other sources, one startling finding in both America and abroad is that, contrary to past assertions, today the faithful are not poor and ignorant, but increasingly from educated upper middle class. In other words, we might be seeing the development of a new invisible state church in America, and it's going to be metagelical, and it's going to be fueled by the chaos that America has seen in the light of the 60s and 70s. Keep clicking that one by mistake. All right. Let's put this one over here. We are probably slowly seeing the evolution of a new metagelical elites in America. As noted in a previous posting for the liturgical Sacramentalist tradition, strict confessional fidelity is an asset, not a liability, but to a point. We've already seen that a politician, you can notice the fact that, oh, what's her name? Is it Lila Rose? She's the ardent Roman Catholic activist against abortion. She and Nancy Pelosi go to the same church. Nobody cares. Nobody says, I can't believe Joe Biden goes to the same church as Lila Rose. Nobody cared. Why? Because when we think of the Roman Catholic Church, we think of it in a certain way. But Pete Hegseth goes to the same church as Doug Wilson, and everybody throws a fit. Well, why don't they throw a fit when Lila Rose and Nancy Pelosi go to the same church? That was the point that I made in the previous post. We've already seen that as a politician, you can do anything you want in your public life, and your priest or bishop won't cut you off from the sacrament. Joe Biden and J.D. Vance get served regardless of their politics and their policies. Pete Hegseth could get in trouble with his Doug Wilson church in a host of ways Biden and Vance never would, or even Putin for that matter. It's interesting how different paradoxical nuances intersect to create particulars out in the real world. In that previous posting, I was riffing off this article, Losing Faith in Atheism. Excerpts from an upcoming book. It's a good piece. The path he shares with us is not unfamiliar. I've heard many renditions of this. He's a good writer, and so it's skillfully articulated. I thought his romantic idealism section was pretty good. He basically said that in the counterculture, there's a certain romantic idealism that sort of became the default American religion. And I thought it was a good observation. A few thoughts stuck out. He's obviously above average in many respects. He can and has read the philosophers, high IQ, successful author, thoughtful man, regular community elite, not Epstein class, New Yorker audience. His Wikipedia page is sparse but sufficient. Unlike assumptions in the mid to early 20th century, most people who are actually participating in church tend to skew better educated. It sort of undermines the religion as a crutch for the stupid argument. He returned to the religion of his youth, and he's Catholic. See, this is again part of this. I'm starting to develop a profile of this type. The sacramentalist tradition affords a looseness that the confessionalist tradition tends to lack. Look at Luke Thompson. Luke Thompson isn't going to go to a confessionalist church. Sam Tiedemann has difficulty in confessionalist churches, obviously because of the creed. If Sam Tiedemann went to a Roman Catholic church, should he just basically keep his mouth shut and not get into trouble? Probably. He's not going to be a priest. The sacramentalist tradition affords a looseness that the confessionalist tradition tends to lack. This is, again, propositional versus procedural. When you go to Roman Catholic Church, if you do the right things, what goes on in your head doesn't really matter so much. You just have to do the right things. It's procedural. Propositional, it's the other register. But these registers aren't completely separable. There are trade-offs with this, especially for those for their own church. A liturgy and sacrament dispensary that doesn't ask too much of your loves, commitments, and convictions. Andrew Sullivan continues to identify as Roman Catholic. Is Andrew Sullivan in alignment with Roman Catholic teaching? Are all of those priests that say they would do a same-sex marriage in alignment with Roman Catholic teaching? Roman Catholics don't do much discipline, apparently. It's no news to the Catholics. This makes for fierce warring in the Roman Catholic Church. They can proxy most of their culture war battles in-house. In some ways, it's big and anonymous. Lila Rose and Nancy Pelosi go to the same church. But obviously, going to the same church in that case means something different from Doug Wilson and Pete Hegseth go to the same church. Nobody seems to mind too much that Rose and Pelosi go to the same church. The fact that Lila Rose is better aligned with Catholic social teaching means not a lot to the church of Biden and Pelosi. Despite what might be said at the National Prayer Breakfast, Trump is a part of no church. Calvin pushed on church discipline as a mark of the church. Understanding Renaissance Catholicism helps me see why he leaned into that. Geneva, of course, burned Servetus. Some of my internet friends never let me forget. Servetus was a very interesting guy, actually. I wish that they had let him live, although there's reason to imagine Servetus's decision is not avoid his own death. Is a case of in the end a costly win in terms of being remembered in history. Suicide by famous reformer, which people then asked follow-up questions, and I had to write more about Servetus in Voices. So, Sam, if you want to go on CRC Voices and school them in Servetus or finally make that definitive Servetus series, I'm there for it. While some run to orthodoxy hoping to avoid the Rose-Pelosi dissonance, that's hardly a haven for that. They've got Putin. Anglicans, of course, have the same issue. A friend of mine from the corner is thinking of heading to Rome. There's a good CRC near him that I've been encouraging him to check out. He's outspoken politically on the left, but just wants a church where left and right can worship together, which the Roman Catholic Church clearly offers. I don't know if it will be a fit for him or not. It helps if the priest keeps his homilies brief and vague. So the CRC's confessional rigor and polity helped it avoid the RCA debacle, but the RCA flexibility helped it for a while take advantage of other evangelical dynamics. The RCA from between 2000 to 2020 filled up nicely with all sorts of diverse evangelicals. I worked on a couple of projects when Rich DeVos gave a whole bunch of money to the Christian Reformed Church to help bring the RCA and the CRC closer together. And so I worked on some projects with RCA ministers. This was before the RCA collapse. And one of my good friends that I worked on a lot of projects with said to me at one point, I haven't done an infant baptism in 15 years. And I was like, have you not had any children in 15 years in your church? He says, no, we just dedicate them. No, that does not wash in the Christian Reformed Church. You do not just walk into church and dedicate a baby. No. So RCA, and I remember having a conversation with staff people at a larger RCA on the north end of town, and staff people came from various other denominations, and one of them was just basically antagonistic towards denominations. Denominations are a farce. It doesn't make any difference that our church is RCA here. It makes no difference at all. They were a big box evangelical church, much more like a non-denominational church. Confessionally flexible, except on a few points. Creedally not flexible, as Sam will remind you. Confessionally flexible on a variety of things. And the RCA worked that for a while, really leaned into church growth. And the RCA, Norman Vincent Peale, Power of Positive Thinking, you can look that up. Richard Schuller, both of them RCA pastors. Again, if there's any church, ironically, that can claim Donald Trump in terms of his past, it's the Reformed Church in America, which just blows your mind. But that's similar to the main line where we're not going to really worry about confessionality. It's much more sort of a, forgive me saying it this way, a cultural Christianity, or at least a procedural Christianity. And a lot of the conservatives who really want to see the Roman Catholic Church purified, well, in some ways, hold on to your chairs. Hank, who very much has my phone number. I can't always pick up the phone. I haven't recently, Hank, but I do get your texts. To the degree that you want to see the Roman Catholic Church purified in confessional ways, you're just bringing your Protestantism with you. You are, Hank. You are. The CRC confessional rigor and polity helped it avoid the RCA debacle, but the RCA flexibility helped it take advantage of other evangelical dynamics when it was growing swiftly among conservative evangelicals. Until all of that growth fled when the evangelicals couldn't overcome the RCA's constitutional polity. And when the many evangelicals that came into the church said, we will not tolerate being in the same denomination as these New York mainline churches and what they're doing with respect to human sexuality, where on paper we have a traditional posture, but there's no discipline enforcing it. When the RCA basically decided, no, we can't do it. We can't do it by synodical vote. Out they all went. And what was left is just basically mainline church collapse. And so I think part of what's happening is we might be seeing the slow, steady progress of a new invisible state church in America, like the main line was, but we're not there and probably not going to be there for a while. But what seems to be happening, though, is that this post-war progressivism continues to sort of atrophy and fracture, and a religious consensus and a very metagelical, the confessionality will be thin, probably on questions that afford family and community order, because that's what's fueling this little bit of religious revival. I want to have the same parents, just two. I want there to be milk in the fridge. I want mom and dad to help support me through college. I want 4 grandparents, not 8, to be there for my child. I want the support, the financial support, the emotional support of my parents all the way through, and I want to give this to my kids. It's a very conservative thing. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think.